His name was Jonathan Blake. He was 34 years old, unmarried, and lived alone in a modest brick apartment building on the south side of Chicago. To neighbors, he was a polite, quiet man who always nodded hello but rarely stopped to talk. He worked long shifts at a warehouse near the industrial corridor, came home carrying a brown paper bag from the corner store, and followed a routine so steady that people said you could set your watch by him. The city he lived in during the summer of 1996 was a place of sharp contrasts. Downtown office towers sparkled in the sun, but only a few miles south, neighborhoods struggled with crime, poverty, and the weight of decades of neglect. Chicago had a rhythm, the roar of the L trains, the blare of horns on congested streets, the hum of late-night diners. And in the middle of that rhythm, Jonathan lived a life that was ordinary, predictable, and invisible. On June 4th, 1996, Jonathan followed the same pattern as always. He clocked out from work just after 6 p.m., picked up groceries, and was seen by a neighbor unlocking his door before dusk. Nothing about that evening seemed unusual. He didn't look anxious or hurried, didn't mention plans, didn't hint at anything out of the ordinary. And yet, that was the last confirmed time anyone ever saw him alive. The next morning, the first cracks appeared in his routine. Jonathan didn't show up for work. At first, co-workers assumed he was sick, but when he failed to call in, something completely out of character, concern began to spread. By midday, his supervisor called his apartment, but the line rang without answer. By evening, Jonathan's sister Angela arrived, worried by the silence. She found his car parked outside, untouched. Mail was stacked in the box, and when she used the spare key to enter, the scene inside froze her in place. Everything looked intact. Dishes from the night before sat in the sink. A half-finished carton of milk soured in the fridge. His jacket hung neatly by the door. The bed had been slept in. There were no signs of forced entry, no overturned furniture, no broken glass. Jonathan had vanished, as if he had simply stepped out, and never returned. Angela called the police that same night. Officers walked through the apartment with flashlights, taking notes. They asked questions she couldn't answer. Did he have enemies? Was he involved in anything illegal? Was he depressed? Angela shook her head to each one. Jonathan was steady, careful, almost boring in his habits. Nothing about him suggested the kind of man who would walk away from his life. Still, the report was filed. Detectives canvassed the building, knocking on doors. One neighbor recalled hearing a door slam late at night. Another thought they had seen Jonathan walking toward his apartment earlier that evening. But the details blurred quickly, uncertain and contradictory. Within days, Jonathan's name was just another entry in the police database. The 1990s in Chicago were years when missing person files stacked high on desks, already buried in paperwork. His case joined dozens of others, all vying for attention in a city stretched thin by crime. For Angela, the days that followed felt unreal. She returned to the apartment repeatedly, hoping to spot something the police had missed: a note, a receipt, a sign. Each time, the silence was the same. His toothbrush stood by the sink, his shoes lined up neatly in the closet, groceries spoiled untouched in the fridge. His life was still there. Jonathan was not. What happened on that June night in 1996 became a question that no one in Chicago could answer. And for 2 decades, that question lingered, unanswered, until the truth emerged from the most ordinary and unthinkable place imaginable: the frame of a worn-out couch, sitting unnoticed in a flea market. When the missing person report was filed, Jonathan Blake's name became one more line in the crowded logbooks of the Chicago Police Department. In 1996, the city was grappling with a surge in violent crime, drug-related disappearances, and carjackings that stretched detectives thin. A warehouse worker who lived alone did not spark headlines, but protocol still required the basics. Detectives began by retracing his last known steps. They spoke with co-workers, who all described him as reliable and predictable. No enemies, no debts, no suspicious behavior. They interviewed neighbors in his apartment building. One insisted they heard a door slam around midnight. Another swore they saw Jonathan coming up the front steps just before dark. But those fragments only deepened the mystery. Nothing lined up with certainty. Angela accompanied detectives into her brother's apartment once more. She walked behind them as they scanned each room, their flashlights cutting across walls and furniture. The scene was eerily ordinary. His wallet and car keys sat neatly on the kitchen counter. His shoes were by the door. The bed was unmade but clearly slept in. The refrigerator hummed softly, holding groceries that were already starting to spoil. There were no signs of struggle, no valuables missing, no damage to doors or windows. Detectives checked his financial records. No unusual withdrawals, no tickets for buses, trains, or flights. No late-night calls on the apartment's landline. The silence in his paper trail mirrored the silence in his apartment. People who choose to disappear usually leave behind hints, withdrawals, purchases, odd conversations. Jonathan left nothing at all. Angela tried to fill in the blanks. She told police about her brother's routine, how he always called their mother once a week, how he never missed work, how his small life was consistent down to the hour. The detectives listened, but she could sense their skepticism. Without evidence of foul play, they were cautious to speculate. "Sometimes people walk away," one officer said. Angela shook her head. "Not Jonathan. He wouldn't just leave." The case was logged as active but low priority. Other emergencies pressed harder, louder, and more violently on the city. Jonathan's file became a thin folder containing a photo, a missing person statement, and a few pages of notes. Still, his sister refused to let him fade quietly. She contacted local news stations, giving them her brother's photograph and a plea for information. A short clip aired one evening, showing Angela outside his apartment, her voice trembling. "My brother wouldn't just vanish. Somebody knows something." For a moment, the city listened. But within days, the story disappeared from headlines, replaced by fresh crimes and newer names. Detectives followed every tip, even when the chances were slim. A bartender thought he had seen Jonathan a few nights before he vanished. A bus driver claimed a man resembling him boarded downtown. Both leads fell apart on closer inspection. Mistaken memories, fuzzy timelines, wrong identities. Each dead end chipped away at the urgency. Jonathan's co-workers organized a small fundraiser to print flyers. His face appeared on telephone poles, laundromat walls, and storefront windows across the South Side. For weeks, his image stared back at passers-by, a frozen reminder of a man who seemed to have been erased. But the posters eventually curled in the rain, bleached by sunlight, until the ink ran faint. Behind closed doors, detectives began admitting what the family already feared. There were no suspects, no crime scene, no solid leads. Nothing that explained how Jonathan Blake could step into his apartment and then vanish completely. For Angela, every ring of the phone became a torment. It could be news, or it could be nothing. Every knock on the door made her pause, hoping for a stranger with answers. But Chicago was a city filled with noise, and her brother's silence was swallowed by it. The truth was clear but unbearable. Jonathan Blake had disappeared into nothing, and yet, even as the case began to cool, his sister clung to the conviction that one day, somehow, someone would find him. The first week after Jonathan Blake vanished felt like a test of how quickly a neighborhood could turn itself into a search party. On a humid Sunday evening, volunteers met in the basement of a small brick church a few blocks from his apartment. Someone spread out photocopied maps. Someone else brought highlighters and masking tape. Angela stood at the front with a stack of flyers, and a photo of her brother in a plastic sleeve, asking for patience and help. A police sergeant addressed the room briefly. "Follow instructions. Don't go alone. Call if you find anything that seems even slightly important." Then people split into groups and filed back into the fading light, each team assigned to a section: the river path, the rail yards, the empty lots that stretched behind warehouse fences. The search began almost immediately after the disappearance. Family, friends, and neighbors joined police officers to sweep the blocks around Jonathan's building, then pushed farther out in slow, deliberate grids. Volunteers stapled flyers to telephone poles and bus stop shelters, handed them to shop owners, and slid them under apartment doors. Search dogs were brought to the alley behind his building, and the vacant lot where kids sometimes cut through after school. The handlers followed the animals' noses along chain-link fences and into the edges of overgrown brush. On the second day, a helicopter made low passes over the river and the freight lines, its thrum falling over the neighborhood like a reminder that time mattered. Tips trickled in, each one logged, most of them thin. After days of effort, nothing surfaced. No footprints, no discarded belongings, no trace at all. The search dragged into the next week, but momentum started to fray. Volunteers still gathered, but the groups were smaller. A local grocer kept a stack of flyers by the register. A bar on the corner agreed to leave a poster in the window. Police set up a temporary tip line and returned a handful of calls that led nowhere. A rumored sighting at a bus stop, a name passed through a cousin of a cousin, a story that sounded more like neighborhood gossip than fact. Detectives checked abandoned buildings with a city inspector, flashlights cutting through dust and the smell of old plaster. Despite the reach, land, air, and door-to-door, not a single tangible clue turned up. By the end of the second week, the city's noise began to swallow the search the way it swallowed everything else. On paper, the case still looked active. Detectives kept a running list of what had been checked: hospitals, shelters, the coroner's records. They reviewed pawnshop logs and asked around at the warehouse where Jonathan worked. His supervisor confirmed the obvious. Jonathan had never missed a shift without a call. He was dependable to a fault. The union rep could only add that his last paycheck went unclaimed. Financials showed no activity. His ATM card sat quiet. The landline records were dull. A call to his mother 2 days before he vanished. A takeout place a week earlier. Nothing on the night itself that changed the math. Cameras were scarce in 1996. The corner store kept an old VHS system pointed mostly at the cigarettes behind the counter. The tape had already been recorded, over by the time detectives came asking. The warehouse used a single security camera at the loading dock, a grainy, static-streaked feed that showed Jonathan leaving the night he disappeared, and nothing more. A transit camera near the train platform had been out of service. The city was not yet wired for the kind of disappearance that could be replayed frame by frame until an answer fell out. The property manager for Jonathan's building was called in. He kept a folder of leases and a ring of keys that looked older than the doors they opened. No complaints had been filed. No reports of arguments in the hallway. No notes about suspicious visitors. If anyone had come or gone late that night, it left no mark on any ledger the building kept. One neighbor suggested that a back stairwell door sometimes stuck open, that you could slip out to the alley without the latch catching. It was the sort of detail detectives wrote down without knowing whether it mattered. Angela began to keep her own binder, plastic sleeves with every flyer, every article, every phone number that might matter someday. She wrote down descriptions of strangers who said they might have seen her brother, then crossed them out when the details fell apart. She called the tip line herself every few days, not because she had something new to add, but because she needed to hear another voice confirm that the file was still on a desk somewhere, not buried beneath a stack of other names. The rumors were predictable and punishing. Someone said Jonathan had been seen at a bar on the west side. The bartender didn't remember him. Someone else claimed he owed money. No one could say to whom. A third rumor had him boarding a bus to St. Louis. The timeline didn't hold. Each theory asked the same question from a different angle. Did he leave on purpose, or did something happen to him? None of the answers rose above speculation. By the end of the month, the official language hardened. No evidence of foul play at this time. We continue to investigate. We are asking the public for assistance. The words formed a kind of scaffolding around the void, something to hold in place, while the real answer remained out of reach. Angela hated those phrases. They sounded like motion, but felt like standing still. Summer in Chicago turned to early fall. Rain peeled the edges of the flyers from brick and metal, ink running into a blur of face and phone number. The church basement that had once been crowded with volunteers now hosted smaller meetings. A few neighbors, a detective when schedules allowed, Angela with her binder. The search maps, once bright with highlighter, faded under fingerprints and coffee rings. The city continued. So did the silence. There were moments when a lead almost felt like something. A used furniture warehouse near the river reported a scuffed jacket left behind in a delivery. It wasn't his. A pair of shoes found beside a rail embankment matched his size, but not his wear pattern. A wallet turned in at a bus terminal carried an ID, but the name wasn't Jonathan's, and the photo was of someone who only vaguely resembled him under flickering fluorescent lights. The detectives did what they could with what they had. They re-interviewed a neighbor who said they'd heard a late-night door slam. On the second telling, the neighbor wasn't sure which night it had been. They asked co-workers if anyone had seen Jonathan arguing with someone at work. No one had. They asked Angela if he'd ever talked about moving, starting over, disappearing. He hadn't. The emptiness of those answers became its own kind of fact, the negative space outlining a figure that refused to come into focus. There was a candlelight vigil in October, just before the first sharp cold settled over the city. Angela stood with friends and strangers in the small courtyard outside Jonathan's building, the wind tugging at paper cups wrapped around thin candles. A pastor spoke, not about closure, but about endurance, about the stubborn work of still looking even when there seemed to be nowhere left to look. For a night, the building felt less like a place where a person had vanished and more like a place where people insisted he still mattered. But the practical machinery of the case slowed. Over time, budgets shrank. New files arrived. Detectives rotated. Jonathan's folder was moved to a cold case shelf, then to another one. The search, once a map on a table with names written in the margins, became a set of forms in a drawer. It was not abandonment, so much as gravity, the force that pulls everything unresolved toward the same quiet place. What remained were the ordinary objects of a life paused in mid-sentence: a jacket on a hook, a pair of shoes by the door, a toothbrush in a cup. And somewhere in the same city, an ordinary object no one would think twice about, a couch, held the answer. The maps and the dogs and the helicopters had all missed. For now, it sat unnoticed, its secret stitched beneath fabric and wood, waiting for the day when weight and time and chance would cause it to give way. By the end of 1996, Jonathan Blake's name no longer carried urgency inside the Chicago Police Department. Detectives moved on to newer cases, fresher crime scenes, louder emergencies that demanded their attention. His file remained open, but thin. A photograph, a missing person report, a handful of notes about interviews that led nowhere. It shifted from the active stack to the shelves where unresolved names collected dust. The official language stayed the same. No evidence of foul play at this time. We continue to investigate. We are asking the public for assistance. Words designed to sound like movement, even as nothing changed. For Angela, life became a cycle of waiting. She called the department every few weeks, asking if anyone had looked again, if there was something new. She spoke to whichever detective happened to be assigned that month. The answers were always polite, always identical. "We'll keep it open," but nothing has surfaced. Each repetition felt like another door closing. Her apartment turned into an archive of absence. A binder of flyers sat on the kitchen table, pages curling at the edges from being handled too often. Plastic sleeves held every article printed about her brother, most no longer than a few paragraphs. She kept lists of numbers, tip lines, detectives, reporters, though many had long since disconnected. On her wall, Jonathan's photo was taped beside a calendar where she circled anniversaries. The day he vanished, his birthday, Christmas. Each circle marked another year without answers. Friends and neighbors drifted away. At first, people stopped by to ask for updates, to bring food, to light candles at vigils. But after months, then years, the visits grew fewer. No one wanted to keep asking the same question when the answer never changed. For Angela, the silence was worse than the questions. Silence meant acceptance, and she refused to accept that her brother could simply vanish into thin air. Chicago itself moved forward. New headlines replaced the old. Scandals and tragedies pushed older names aside. Jonathan's case appeared only occasionally, in year-end roundups of unsolved disappearances, a single line in a column otherwise filled with forgotten faces. The city was full of missing people, and his name was one more among them. By the early 2000s, Angela found herself imagining possibilities she had once rejected. Perhaps Jonathan had been killed and buried in some unmarked corner of the city. Perhaps he had left willingly, building a life under a new name. Neither option brought comfort. One meant he was gone forever. The other meant he had chosen to leave. Both explanations hurt in different ways. Detectives occasionally reopened the file, not with new evidence, but with new eyes. A young investigator would flip through the pages, make a few calls, revisit old notes. But each time the cycle ended the same. Nothing new, nothing useful, nothing to change the status of the case. Jonathan Blake remained missing, presumed dead. The years hardened into decades. Chicago changed. Neighborhoods gentrified, factories closed, new construction rose where old buildings crumbled. The skyline shifted, the city reinvented itself. But Jonathan's story stayed stuck in 1996, a frozen image of a man who never came home. For Angela, hope became something complicated. She lit candles on his birthday. She kept his photograph framed on a dresser. But she also learned to live in the absence, to carry the unanswered questions like stones in her pocket. She remarried, moved once, tried to find normalcy. But Jonathan's disappearance followed her everywhere. 20 years is a long time to wait for an answer. Long enough for neighbors to forget, for detectives to retire, for entire neighborhoods to transform. And yet, in 2016, Jonathan's name would return to headlines in the most surreal way imaginable. The truth had been sitting unnoticed, stitched into wood and fabric, traded hand to hand without suspicion. It wasn't the city that gave up its secret. It was a piece of furniture. An old couch, bought secondhand at a flea market, would finally reveal what 2 decades of police work, search parties, and rumors could not. The silence that had stretched across 20 years was about to be broken. It was the summer of 2016 when the silence finally cracked. Jonathan Blake had been gone for 2 decades, his name all but erased from the city's memory. His file still existed, technically open, but it had been years since anyone expected progress. For his family, hope had thinned into routine, lighting candles, speaking his name, refusing to let him vanish completely. And then, in the most ordinary of places, the answer appeared. On a humid Saturday afternoon, a man browsing stalls at a flea market on Chicago's west side stopped at a furniture vendor. Among the mismatched chairs and chipped tables sat a couch. Its cushions were faded, fabric frayed, the kind of piece someone buys not for style, but for necessity. The buyer haggled, loaded it into a borrowed truck, and drove it home. For 2 days, it sat against the wall of his apartment, unnoticed. On the third, while maneuvering it through a narrow hallway, the frame gave a sharp crack. Something inside shifted, heavy and unnatural. Thinking it might be old tools or forgotten junk, the man cut into the lining. What fell out froze him where he stood. Bones entangled in fabric, fragments of clothing, a brittle leather wallet that disintegrated when touched. Shocked, he stumbled back, grabbed his phone, and called 911. Detectives arrived quickly, securing the scene. They knew almost immediately that this was not a recent death. The remains were decades old, preserved only by time and concealment. Among the fragments lay an ID card, faded, worn, but legible enough to read a name long absent from headlines: Jonathan Blake. For the Blake family, the call from police felt like being dropped into the past. Angela said later that hearing her brother's name spoken by a detective after 20 years was like standing once again in his apartment, staring at the jacket by the door. Except this time, there was no uncertainty. Jonathan had been found. The question of how he ended up inside a couch remained unanswered. Theories emerged that he had been killed and hidden by someone with access to his building, that the couch itself had traveled from place to place, traded and sold until its secret passed unnoticed. Police admitted that, after so much time, many details would never be resolved. The evidence was too old, the trail too cold, the witnesses long gone. Still, the discovery forced Chicago to remember. Local papers ran with headlines: "Remains found in couch, identified as man missing since 1996. News segments replayed Angela's earlier interviews, her pleas from years before, now overlaid with footage of the market where the couch had been bought. Neighbors who remembered Jonathan spoke with disbelief. The man they once saw walking home from work had been hidden in plain sight all along. For Angela, the discovery brought a strange kind of closure. "At least we know," she told reporters. "At least he isn't just a question anymore." It wasn't justice, it wasn't resolution, but it was an answer. And after 20 years of silence, that answer was something she could hold. Jonathan Blake's story ended not with a solved case or a confession, but with the creak of old wood and fabric splitting open in a stranger's living room. A reminder that some of the darkest secrets are not buried deep, but woven into the most ordinary parts of life, waiting, hidden, until chance finally forces them into the light.